To answer that question, we have to go a few years before his birth. In 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire fell, and it was overcome by barbarians, mainly Goths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and others. And the western part of the Roman Empire descended into a total anarchy and loss of civilization. Justinian was born near the city of Skopje, and he was born 6 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire fell into anarchy and ruled by barbarians, the Goths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and others. And Justinian's mission in life, his main mission, was to try to reunite the Roman Empire together and bring it back to the greatness that it had at its height under Constantine and others. And he worked all his life to try to get that achieved. He was able to achieve quite a bit of it in the fact that he actually reconquered many of the areas that were falling apart from the Roman Empire, and he brought them back together. And that included Italy, which was ruled by the Goths. His general Belisarius defeated the Goths. He defeated the Vandals of North Africa and reunited North Africa with the Roman Empire. He defeated the rulers, the Visigoths in Spain, and reunited much of Spain with the Roman Empire. So he was able to bring back most of the Roman Empire together after it had fallen apart in the West altogether. And among other things, that was very important for Justinian was the fact that he was extremely ascetic and extremely philosophical. He was what might be called a philosopher king, as the classical Greeks defined it. A king who was guided by moral principles and moral ideas that imbued his policies and his attempt to help all the people of his empire. He came to Constantinople as a young man and from a very poor family, and his uncle had already come to Constantinople, also as a young man from a very poor family. His uncle Justin was a guard, imperial guard, and eventually worked his way to become the commander of the imperial guard, and then he was chosen as emperor of the Roman Empire. His uncle took Justinian in when he came to Constantinople and introduced him to all the important people, gave him very important assignments, and he also gave Justinian much of his own power. So Justinian at an early age actually became the effective ruler of the empire, as his uncle was not really in the best, you might say, mental shape to be able to do a good job as such. Justinian's original name was Petrus Sabatius. He was actually, which means Peter. His original name was Peter. And once he came to Constantinople, his uncle officially adopted him. So he changed the name from Peter to Justinian based on his uncle's name, Justin. And from then on, he was known as Justinian only. Justinian, in his early years as emperor, which he started being an emperor in 527, Justinian was extremely hardworking as emperor. He was sometimes known as the ruler who never sleeps, because he used to work at his job, you might say, from morning to late at night. Yeah, and he was not interested in parties. He was not interested in carousing. In fact, As far as we know, he had no romance or anything until he was well along in his 40s when he met Theodora. Now, Theodora is a very controversial person in a number of ways. Procopius, who was a contemporary of Justinian and actually an official of the Eastern Roman Empire, has some unflattering things to say about Theodora. She was allegedly a prostitute. She was allegedly a obscene performer before crowds. And this is, however, challenged by some other historians, later historians, who do not believe that Justinian, being the person that he was, would so easily be enamored of somebody like that. But he did become in love with her when he was in his 40s. As far as we know, he had no romance, no love affair, no anything like that until he was well along in his 40s when he met Theodora, and he married her. And from what we know afterwards was that Theodora became an extremely moral and religious person. In fact, according to the Orthodox Church, she is considered a saint. Justinian and Theodora became co-rulers of the Eastern Roman Empire in 527. And at the beginning, there were some problems that Justinian had because the empire had inadequate funding. He raised the taxes to try to build up the defense of the empire, to try to provide money for the church, to try to provide money for cultural activities for hospitals, hospices, and the poor, and so on. So there was some, quite a bit of dissatisfaction against him at the beginning. And in 532, major rioting broke out in Constantinople. And these were called the Nike riots, which turned into a full-scale rebellion in 532. Full-scale rebellion which started as a dispute between different partisans of different racing teams in the Hippodrome in Constantinople. At that time, Constantinople was divided into what were called different partisans of different teams. And there were, the main teams were the blues and the greens. And Justinian was a supporter of the blues. But there was a big argument between the blues and the greens over how the one race was conducted and how it ended, and about the winner of the race. And they started fighting among themselves, rioting, and Justinian afterwards tried to quell that riot. Justinian captured some of the ringleaders and had them executed. This caused the rioting to become even worse, and it turned into an actual rebellion against Justinian. They started burning down the city of Constantinople. Almost half the city was burned, rioting, looting, killing. The original church of Hagia Sophia was destroyed, and there was an attack in the palace and Justinian's quarters. It looked like the Roman Empire was about to end altogether in the east as well as it had ended in the west. Justinian tried to mollify the rioters and granted many of the demands of the rioters, including firing some key officials. But the rioters, now the rebels, wanted more. They wanted Justinian to resign and another person to take over as emperor. He was considering actually leaving the city and letting it go, letting the new person take over. But then Theodora stepped in, according to Procopius, who doesn't like Theodora and has negative things to say about her. She spoke up, and she actually persuaded Justinian to stop the rebels and defeat the rebellion. And after her speech in council, he was able to actually get enough determination to send his army under General Belisarius and others to stop the rebellion, and he saved Constantinople. According to Procopius, about 30,000 rioters were killed, which is a possibility, though we cannot take it for granted, because Procopius tends to exaggerate anything that's negative about Justinian and Theodora, and so we have to take what he says about that with a grain of salt. However, it is clear this was not just a mere rioting, and that they had to be stopped, or civilization as they knew it would end in the Eastern Roman Empire as well. So this was successfully achieved. First of all, what Justinian did, especially using his, as a go-between, his general Narses. Narses was a eunuch, and at that time there were many eunuchs who were in very high position. Narses was a minister and a general, and he was pretty popular among the people. And he went to the Hippodrome, and he persuaded the blues, first of all, the blues, which were the side of Justinian, to depart from the rioting, to stop rioting. He spoke to them, gave a speech, telling them Justinian is on their side, and he always supported the blues. You shouldn't be against them, and you should not be with the Greens to try to destroy Justinian's rule. And the blues listened, and the blues left the rioting. This made it a lot easier to end the fighting of the Greens, because they were now isolated. There were very few people who supported them outside of the Green fanatic supporters. And in a matter of days, actually, the rebellion was ended, and Justinian was back in his position as the emperor without challenge. There was so much destruction and burning of Constantinople that reputable historians say that about half the city was destroyed and burned to the ground, half of the city. At that time, Constantinople was the greatest city in the world, by far. It had about 1 million people in population. It was huge, and you can imagine that. If the half of the city is destroyed, that there was hundreds of thousands of people who were left homeless, who were left suffering because. So you had a huge problem that Justinian was able to solve within about a week. The rebellion, and I think we should call it a rebellion rather than rioting, because it was clear that they wanted Justinian out. The leaders of the rebellion said that they wanted him out, they wanted him to leave, they wanted him to be replaced by another emperor, a nephew of a previous emperor. So we have now the rioting is ended and peace is there, but half the city is in ruins, and half the city is devastated, and half the population is in poverty, and half the population is homeless. This is a huge, huge problem for Justinian, but he set about to do practically miracles in order to revive the city. He established a huge, incredible program of rebuilding the city. He made new churches, especially he built a new church in the Hagia Sophia, which exists to this day, which was the greatest for more than 1,000 years. It was the greatest building in the whole world. And there was still many architects think it's a miracle that it managed to be built and that it managed to survive to this day. And there's an interesting story about the Hagia Sophia. The architects could not figure out how to build the church to the degree that Justinian wanted it, especially to have the roof that would not collapse under the weight, that would be safe. And Then Justinian said that he had a dream. He saw an angel came to him in a dream, and the angel showed him exactly how the roof should be built so that it would be safe and it would continue. And the architects actually built the roof of the Hagia Sophia according to Justinian's directives. And that remained in very solid position for many centuries. And it's interesting that he was able to do that. He came up with the answer of how to build the roof architecturally, even though he had no knowledge of architecture. He never studied architecture. It was the vision that he had in his dream that provided a solution to how to build the roof of the Hagia Sophia. So which some people consider a miracle in itself. So he was able to rebuild the city to where it became better and more beautiful and more prosperous than ever before. An age of unparalleled prosperity developed through his rule, Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire. That prosperity was, however, funded not as much by taxes as previously. It was funded again to be rebuilt in a wonderful manner by the conquest of the barbarians who had conquered many areas, including especially the Vandals in North Africa, and the Goths, Visigoths in Spain, Ostrogoths in Italy. All these barbarians, through their own conquest, had built up huge treasures, incredible treasures, which his Justinian generals managed to get the treasures, gold, silver, precious articles of the barbarians that they conquered, and they gave that to Justinian. And Justinian used that huge amount of gold, silver, precious materials to build the churches, to rebuild the city, to provide for the needs of the people. So he was not in need so much to tax heavily as he had at the beginning. And since his taxation was actually lessened as a burden, he became more popular as such. Because they saw new buildings, everything rising around, the new prosperity, new trade. The Roman Empire, much of the Roman Empire was reunited, which opened the trade avenues, which had been closed by the barbarians. And Constantinople became a center of commerce. Another thing that Justinian managed to do, which was very important, and perhaps even more important than many of the other things, was that he decided to modernize, streamline, and improve the Roman law and write up books of law. The Justinian, Code of Justinian, he actually changed the law to make it more consistent, more practical, more fair to everybody. Because through the centuries, there were many, many rules of Roman law that developed that really made no sense or were contradicted by other rules of the Roman law. So examples could be like there were rules of Roman law that says that the family, father of the family, pater familias, had the absolute control of his children and absolute control of his wife, could do whatever they want. But there were also rules that said that children had rights and the wives had rights, which had to be protected. So there was an inconsistency there that he changed to make it consistent, to show that the pater familias, the father of the family, did not have absolute control, absolute right to do whatever he wanted. In this, by the way, Theodora was very important, because Theodora actually was a co-ruler of the empire. Justinian made her a co-ruler, and he gave her the right to dictate some of the laws. And she actually developed certain laws that gave more rights to women. You might say that she was really perhaps the first feminist concerned with the rights of women. So she made laws that protected the women in case of divorce, that assured women that they could have some of their property, and they could keep some property in case of divorce, to make it possible for them to survive. They had some rights of their children. Well, previously, under Roman law, the way it was before, women had no rights in case of divorce. Everything was on the husband's side. All the power was on the husband's side. Also, she had other rules that she put in, like she made laws forbidding the trafficking of women for sexual purposes. And she also created shelters for abused women and ways where women could complain if they were abused. So there were quite a few female-oriented protective rights that Theodora put in with the full approval of Justinian. The two of them seem to have been consistently together in all their main endeavors throughout their lives. It was an incredible love story, a love story between a middle-aged man in his 40s when he married her. She was in her 20s, and they had incredible connection all their life. But she died about 20 years before him. He never remarried. As far as we know, he never had anything to do with another woman. He devoted himself from morning to night. He devoted himself to the well-being of the empire. That was his consistent desire, his consistent work, his consistent hope to do whatever he can for the empire and for the Christian faith. He was extremely religious Orthodox Christian. He believed that the Orthodoxy should be preserved, and he fought. Actually, Justinian made illegal certain heresies in order to protect the purity of the Orthodox faith. He was known to be very religious in his practices. So during Great Lent, he was known not to eat anything except bread and drink anything except water. Very abstemious during Great Lent. And he was very protective of the church, building numerous churches. According to some counts, dozens and dozens of churches, provided money for religious establishments, and funding conversions of and missionary work of the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church started spreading among the barbarians during his rule, and many converted. Justinian was chosen by the people. He was elected to be emperor, which is a kind of an early form of democracy that we see here, which is probably a continuation from the ancient Greek democratic institutes. Well, Belisarius was a remarkable general. When you look at the conquests that he achieved, they actually surpassed many of the famous generals of the past. He defeated overwhelmingly greater forces, much greater forces that the Goths had, and he never had an army which was much more than about 20 to 30,000 men. In some cases, the Goths had more than twice the army of Belisarius. He defeated the Vandals in Africa with an army of only about 20,000 men or so against much greater forces. He stopped the invasion of the Shah of Persia and forced him to move back his armies. Interestingly enough, Belisarius was extremely loyal to Justinian. He actually had the power with his army, which he trained to a superb degree, and he had an elite guard of several thousand men around him who were super soldiers in many ways. He trained them so they would be loyal to him. He could have overcome the empire himself. He could have thrown out Justinian easily, because Justinian had no personal army. The army was all under Belisarius, and they were fiercely loyal to him. But he was loyal to Justinian, and he was faithful to his emperor, to his empire, and stayed faithful to the very end. He died in the same year as Justinian. They died within months of each other. Well, that is unusual. Justinian has some guards, but not that many. And he was known as being extremely approachable by the people. The people could come to him, knock on the door of the palace, and want to talk to him and complain to him about this and that, and he would see them. He always had some guards, but not a huge amount of guards. And he had become quite popular after the successes of Belisarius. He was able to provide for the welfare of the people, to rebuild Constantinople, which provided for tens of thousands of jobs, good paying jobs for the people, lowering taxes after the treasure of Belisarius was given to him, and he was able to lower taxes as well. And, essentially he became quite beloved by the people. But that was his purpose, to make Rome great again, definitely, to bring back the greatness of the Roman Empire in every way possible. And this is something which was the number one priority for him, to have the greatness of the Roman Empire come back. And he did, for the most part, come back during his time, and remained, actually, much of the conquered area remained with the Roman Empire for centuries, for quite a while. And so it took the Arab conquest to take it back, like a couple hundred years after Justinian. And they conquered North Africa and made it Islamic. Justinian reigned for 38 years, which were considered 38 of the most glorious years in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. And he died at age 83 in 565.